I hope you enjoyed our anthem this morning. This is Calvin's new favorite song. He can't get it out of his head. He said it's going to be stuck in all your heads today too, so we'll find out if that's true. But this used to be this was my niece's favorite song for a number of years ago when she was in kindergarten. Now she's in about third grade, I think. And it's a pretty funny song, right? I mean, no matter how many times the duck went to the lemonade stand, he was never going to find any grapes, was he? But he just kept going day after day, up to the lemonade stand looking for grapes. It seems kind of ridiculous if we think about it from a logical standpoint. But then again, maybe this duck is kind of like us in some ways. Maybe somehow we all find ourselves looking for grapes at a lemonade stand, in a manner of speaking. But maybe I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I'll go back to lemons and grapes later. Because today, I don't want to talk about grapes. I want to talk about taking a break, as God has planned it for us in this thing that we call the Sabbath. And this is not a very popular topic, Sabbath, in our 24/7 next day guaranteed delivery kind of world that we live in now, is it? And one might even ask the question, is it even possible to take a Sabbath in today's world? I mean, in a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week, constant Wi-Fi world, is it ever really possible to take a Sabbath? Some people really ask that question. Well, my short answer is that yes, it is possible. We just have to stop looking for grapes at the lemonade stand. But I'm getting ahead of myself again, so let me try to explain. I'll get back to that later. Back to the Sabbath. For those who don't know what a Sabbath is, it was a day of rest instituted by God. In Spanish, it's very interesting, the word Saturday is Sabbath. So in the Spanish language, you still have the connection between the day of rest, which for the Jewish people was Saturday. They started counting their week. Day one would have been Sunday, right? Monday would have been the second day of the week, and you go on through till the seventh day when God rested. That would be Saturday. So for Spanish language, that connection is still there. But it was a day of rest that was instituted by God. We read about it in the Bible. Even though a lot of Christians don't really know what to do with this thing called Sabbath, when you start to read the Bible, you find it literally everywhere. From the first page of the Bible right through to the end, you find references to the Sabbath, to the day of rest, to a rest for God's people, constantly as a constant sort of subplot, subtext going on in the Bible. You can start right from Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, right from the beginning of the whole Bible story. We see a clear message that Sabbath as a day of rest was integral to God's design of the rhythms of creation. God completed all the work that he did in 6 days and then rested on the seventh day. If you read Genesis chapter 1, that's kind of the rhythm into chapter 2. That's kind of the rhythm of creation. 6 days of creating work, and then the seventh day was a day of rest. And so it's clear that God planned not only for us humans, but for all of creation to get a break from the constant, non-stop, hectic pace of life. This was not supposed to be just a day off. It was supposed to be a day of rest, a day of renewal for creation as well as us, and a day of reflection, especially for us humans. I'll get more into those 3 R's in a minute. But as soon as you start to talk about Sabbath, immediately you get into a discussion of time management in our own cultures. And in the ancient times, of course, the entire society was taking the Sabbath, was taking a break, right? As a culture. We don't really live in a culture that ever takes a break anymore, right? And so when you start to talk about Sabbath, you get into questions of managing time, and the first thing someone will say is, I don't have time for that, right? Oh, me? No, I'm busy. I'm a working man or woman, right? I don't have time for that rest stuff, right? That's what people often say. There's too much to do. I can rest when I'm dead. Have you ever heard that? I can rest when I'm dead. I used to say that. It used to be my mantra when I was in my 20s and didn't know any better, right? Well, one thing I can guarantee you is that that approach to life will certainly get you dead faster than if you learn to pace yourself and take a break. Because even cold, hard science these days will tell you that a day of rest every week just makes good sense in terms of health and wholeness. It reduces stress, it improves circulation, reduces the risk of heart disease, improves creativity and productivity, and literally adds years to your life. When it comes to time management, whether or not to take a Sabbath is just simply a question of long-term versus short-term benefits, right? Are all those extra overtime hours really worth it? All the time spent resolving crises late at night or early in the morning, if you're not going to be around to enjoy the benefits of the work that you've been doing. What you gain in the short term, you lose in the long run. It's simply a fact of life that overworked and stressed out people die before those who learn to pace themselves. I had to find this out the hard way. I had to end up lying on a couch for several days, unable to move, before I realized that my body needed a rest from time to time. Right? Around that time, when I was a missionary in Mexico, I heard a pastor preach a sermon that really impacted my life. At the time when I was that guy, the super busy, I'll rest when I'm dead kind of person. That pastor said that we all complain that we don't have time. This was before the internet. Imagine now the situation. But he said we all complain that we don't have time, but actually every single person on the earth, this pastor said, has the same amount of time. We get 24 hours per day, 7 days per week, 365 days per year. Everybody gets the same thing, right? There's no person who was born with less time than somebody else has. It's just simply a question left up to us of what to do with that time that we're given. So it's never really true to say that we don't have time to take a day of rest. It all depends on how we manage the time that we have been given. Sabbath, as we read the Bible, is not only a day of rest. We find that Sabbath is part of God's creative work. I had never noticed this before, but I've been reading some books about the Sabbath, and someone pointed out that the Sabbath itself, the day of rest, was listed as part of God's creative work. And there's something else about it that's very interesting if you think about it. In the Genesis story of creation, the last thing God made was what? Do you remember? Day 6. This is important for you. God made you. God made humans, right? If you go through the 6 days of creation, right? God made the sun, the moon, the earth, and the stars, and day, night, oceans, heavens, all that stuff. When he gets to day 6, he makes us, right? And immediately after making us, he rested, right? So think about this. Isn't this interesting? Adam and Eve, their first complete day in creation was a Sabbath. Isn't that amazing? Welcome to the world, guys. Check out everything I made. Isn't it good? Look at this garden. Okay, take the day off. Let's rest. That's a powerful statement if you think about the importance of rest, the importance of Sabbath. Can you think of a job today where you go for the interview, you get hired, and they say, okay, congratulations, you got the job. Tomorrow you get a day off and you're going to get Probably not going to happen, sorry. I don't know any jobs like that. If I hear of one, I'll let you know. But that's effectively how God underlined the importance of Sabbath, right? He wanted them to see how important it was. It was fundamental to his work of creation. Sabbath brings balance to our lives. If Sabbath is done right, it creates a balance between work and rest. As we read the biblical narrative, we see that it was God's intention that all creation, that all human beings would lead a balanced life, right? But the world nowadays doesn't really work that way anymore. Broadly speaking, I would say that nowadays we have 4 basic modes of existence when it comes to work and rest. We have either full employment, which often involves a lot of mandatory overtime, right? Right? If you have a full-time job, don't you often get asked to work extra hours? Of course, they'll pay you for it, but it comes with the package. So working full-time, which often means working too much. Then there is part-time work. Then there's unemployment. And then there's retirement, right? And there's no judgment here, by the way, against retired people. And by the way, I've known a lot of overworked retired people, okay? The fact that you're not getting paid does not mean that you're not overworked. That also happens a lot. And there's no judgment against unemployed people who are actively seeking employment, doing whatever work they can get their hands on in the meantime. But the Bible underlines 2 extremes of life as being out of balance. The first is work with no rest. The second is rest with no work. Work with no rest is what the Bible calls slavery, right? That was the condition of the people of Israel in Egypt when God sent Moses on the mission of rescuing them and bringing them out of slavery. A lot of times we look for a social justice message in this whole thing of Exodus, and that's part of the message. God seeing the suffering of the people and bringing them out. But there's an interesting subtext there. It's interesting to me that in Exodus chapter 5, when Moses first goes to Pharaoh, he doesn't say, "Let my people go." The first words out of his mouth is, "Yahweh, the God of everything, is asking your permission to allow the Israelites to go into the wilderness for a vacation, a festival before their God." Right? God starts off going to Pharaoh, sending Moses to Pharaoh to ask the permission for these slaves to have a Sabbath. Of course, it's refused, and that begins the whole Exodus adventure of finally leading the people to freedom from slavery. If you look at Exodus chapter 20, once the law is instituted, we read it this morning, you go through the list of what we call the 10 Commandments, right? The Big 10. Isn't it interesting as you go through that list? I invite you to read it on your own when you have a little more time. Exodus chapter 20, the majority of the text is dedicated to the Sabbath. Right? Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy, take a rest from your work, let your sons, daughters, male, female servants, your animals, your foreigners, everybody rest. Rest, rest, rest. Right? He simply drills it into their heads, the importance of rest. Work without rest is called slavery. And of course the opposite, rest and no work, the Bible calls laziness. Right? In 2 Thessalonians Chapter 3, Paul confronts this kind of problem in the churches, where people are simply sitting at home, letting others work to put food on their table and support them while they were twiddling their thumbs waiting for the second coming of Jesus. Jesus is coming, so I'm just going to relax, right? I'm not going to do any work. And Paul's response to that situation was, if anyone refuses to work, then I guess they don't need to eat either, right? In other words, if you do not want to contribute productively to the faith community that is nurturing you, even in a volunteer capacity, then you are simply abusing the system. You shouldn't be taking benefits if you don't want to contribute to the resources. Both overwork and non-work are patterns of life that are out of balance from a biblical standpoint. Both are looking for grapes at a lemonade stand in their own way. God's vision is grapes from the store and lemonade from the stand. A balance between work and rest. Speaking of time management, I gotta get moving here. A few aspects of Sabbath I want to bring out briefly as I close. Sabbath gives us divine perspective on all of life. Imagine that you're in the middle of some super stressful project and you decide to take a Sabbath rest just for a day. Our modern logical mind would call that wasting time, but nothing could be further from the truth. Taking a Sabbath and dedicating that day of rest to God is to declare God's lordship over time and over all the work that we are working on. No matter what we're involved in, whatever we're obsessed or stressing over, Sabbath is a reminder that it's all temporary. It's all going to come to an end, one way or another. To Sabbath is to look at time from God's perspective. And that change of perspective might even show us that part of what we're stressing out about is not really even necessary. It might even encourage us to reorder the management of the rest of our lives as a reflection of what we learn from the Sabbath. And Sabbath gives us time to do that thing that we say we never have time to do, and probably, honestly, many of us dread to reflect. Speaking for myself, when I take a real Sabbath, and that doesn't mean simply not arriving at the church building, that means turning off all electronic devices and not working on my sermon or anything like that, right? If I take a Sabbath like that, what do you think happens? I start thinking, right? I start thinking about what my life is about where my priorities are, where I'm investing my time and my energies. I have to reflect a little. And if we're honest, sometimes we really hate doing that, don't we? We want to serve God, we want to work for God, but the annoying thing about taking a Sabbath is that means God starts to get up in my business, right? He starts to mess with my stuff, mess with my priorities, mess with what I want to do with my life. And I honestly don't like it when God does that, right? I would prefer to keep him at arm's length and just keep using my electronic devices 24/7 to distract myself away from self-reflection. But that makes me wonder, why would I prefer to stay in that digital world rather than spend time with God? Am I not looking for grapes at the lemonade stand, right? Am I not looking for meaning in too much in something else that's not God? Am I afraid of what God might demand of me? Do I worry what I might have to deal with, what I might have to change? Doing Sabbath will cause you to reflect, and it will challenge you. Sabbath is an act of worship. To Sabbath is to proclaim God as the Lord over all of my life. I heard a pastor preaching to his church about worship recently, and he said, don't think that what we do here on Sunday is the worship service that you offer to God. He said, what you do with the rest of your life, that's the service. And that really got me thinking. To take a Sabbath, not just as a day off, but as a day dedicated to God, is to move the worship of God out of the sanctuary and into my life. In a very powerful way. Sabbath is an act of discipleship, following Jesus Christ with our lives. Jesus taught his disciples to keep the Sabbath just as he taught them to fast and to pray and to offer every other kind of worship to God. Now, granted, Jesus did get in trouble for doing some things on the Sabbath that other people thought he shouldn't be doing, like healing people, right? But that's simply because Jesus had a little bit different perspective on what work was on the Sabbath. And I think it's a really good example that Jesus didn't simply avoid emergencies on the Sabbath, right? When somebody needed help, he would drop his Sabbath thing and help that person because he knew that's what God had sent him there to do, right? Sabbath is not a day to avoid caring for people in need. If there's a true emergency that needs to be dealt with on the Sabbath, Jesus shows that there's no sin in doing that. But he did teach his disciples the importance of rest and time with God out of the busy schedule of ministry and service. To keep Sabbath is to follow the example and the leadership of Jesus Christ. And I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but the Lord's table, where we're moving in just a moment, is the ultimate place of rest. What did Jesus say when he gave his body and shed his blood for us on the cross? It is finished. The work is done. The battle is won. We can take a rest. As we prepare our hearts and our minds to come to this table, let's reflect upon how Christ offers us rest at this place. Let us pray. Gracious God, we thank you for your word to us. We thank you for this message of Sabbath that you continuously send to us. We confess that our world is set and our cultures are set against the Sabbath, and it's easy for us to go along with that. Speak to us, Lord, and prepare our hearts and our minds as we come to your table to seek the rest that you offer to us. We pray this in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.